Hey everyone, before we dive into tonight's investigation, if you're enjoying the content and want to help the channel grow, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing. It genuinely helps more than you could possibly know, and makes a massive difference in getting these stories out to more people. Also, if you're up for it, drop a comment letting us know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in from, whether you're winding down for the night or just starting your day. No pressure though, only if you want to share. Alright, let's get into tonight's investigation. On the night of April 14th, 1912, the RMS Titanic struck an iceberg in the North Atlantic and sank, taking more than 1,500 souls with her to the bottom of the ocean. It remains one of the most famous maritime disasters in history, a tragedy that has captivated the public imagination for more than a century through books, films, and countless documentaries. But what if the ship that sank that night wasn't the Titanic at all? What if it was her older, damaged sister ship, the Olympic, deliberately sent to the bottom of the ocean as part of the most audacious insurance fraud in history? What if the unsinkable Titanic never actually sank, but instead sailed for decades under a different name, while her owners collected millions in insurance money? This isn't just wild speculation. It's a theory supported by photographic evidence, eyewitness testimony, suspicious changes made just before the maiden voyage, and documented financial desperation at the White Star Line that would have made such a fraud not just possible, but necessary for the company's survival. Welcome to the Titanic switch theory, a conspiracy that suggests the most famous shipwreck in history was actually a carefully orchestrated insurance scam that murdered more than 1,500 people for profit. Because if it's true, then everything we know about that tragic night is a lie, and one of history's greatest disasters was actually one of history's greatest crimes. The story begins not in 1912, but in 1911, with a collision that would set in motion a chain of events leading to one of the most elaborate frauds ever conceived. On September 20, 1911, the RMS Olympic, the first of 3 sister ships built by the White Star Line, was departing Southampton on her 5th commercial voyage when disaster struck. As the massive liner manoeuvred through the busy harbour, she collided with HMS Hawke, a Royal Navy cruiser. The collision was catastrophic for the Olympic. The Hawke's reinforced bow, specifically designed for ramming enemy vessels, tore into the Olympic's starboard side, creating 2 massive gashes. One hole measured 10 feet wide and ran from above the waterline down to below it. A second breach opened below the waterline, flooding 2 of the ship's watertight compartments. The Olympic managed to limp back to port, without sinking, but the damage was severe. More importantly, the subsequent investigation concluded that the Olympic was at fault for the collision. The Royal Navy's HMS Hawke had been pulled into the Olympic's wake due to the massive displacement of water created by the huge liner, a phenomenon the Olympic's captain should have anticipated and avoided. This finding had devastating financial implications for the White Star Line. Because the Olympic was deemed responsible, the company's insurance would not cover the repairs. Moreover, the Royal Navy was now seeking compensation for damage to the Hawke. The White Star Line found itself facing enormous unexpected costs at the worst possible time. The Olympic was towed to Belfast, to the Harland and Wolff shipyard where she had been built, for repairs that would take months and cost a fortune the White Star Line didn't have. And sitting right next to her in the shipyard, nearing completion, was her younger sister ship, the Titanic. This is where the conspiracy theory begins. According to researchers who have studied the evidence, this is when someone at the White Star Line or Harland and Wolff had a terrible idea. What if they could turn this disaster into an opportunity? What if they could switch the identities of the 2 ships, send the damaged Olympic out as the Titanic, arrange for her to sink in a way that would appear accidental, and collect the insurance money? The plan would require coordination at the highest levels of both companies. It would require hundreds of workers to participate in the switch, or at least remain silent about what they were seeing. It would require falsifying countless documents and registry numbers, and it would require a willingness to potentially sacrifice hundreds or even thousands of innocent lives. But if it worked, it would save the White Star Line from financial ruin and potentially net millions in insurance payments. The only question was whether they were desperate enough to actually do it. To understand why the White Star Line might have been willing to contemplate such a monstrous fraud, you need to understand the financial pressures the company was facing in 1911 and 1912. These pressures went far beyond the cost of repairing the Olympic. The White Star Line was owned by International Mercantile Marine, a massive shipping trust controlled by American financier J.P. Morgan. Morgan had assembled IMM in 1902 by purchasing multiple shipping companies, including White Star, with the goal of dominating transatlantic passenger service. He had invested enormous sums in this venture, and by 1911 he was expecting returns on that investment. But the shipping business was viciously competitive and capital-intensive. White Star's main rival, the Cunard Line, had recently launched two revolutionary ships, the Lusitania and Mauretania, which were faster and more luxurious than anything White Star could offer. These Cunard liners were capturing the most profitable passengers, the wealthy first-class travellers who paid premium fares. White Star's response was to build three enormous sister ships that would surpass Cunard's vessels in size and luxury, if not in speed. The Olympic, Titanic and Britannic represented the company's entire strategy for competing in the transatlantic market. They had bet everything on these ships. The construction costs were staggering. The Olympic alone cost £3 million to build, equivalent to about £370 million, or nearly $500 million today. The Titanic cost slightly more. These were the most expensive civilian vessels ever constructed, and the White Star Line had committed to building three of them. The financial model depended on all three ships entering service successfully, operating profitably, and paying back the enormous investment over years of reliable service. The collision with the Hawk threw all of these calculations into chaos. The Olympic was out of service for months, not earning revenue while still requiring maintenance and crew wages. The repairs would cost hundreds of thousands of pounds that the company hadn't budgeted for. The Royal Navy's compensation claim would cost even more, and the Titanic's completion was delayed because workers and materials had to be diverted to repair the Olympic. Even worse, the Hawk incident had damaged the Olympic's reputation before she had even completed her first year of service. Passengers were beginning to question whether these enormous new ships were really as safe as the White Star Line claimed. Bookings were down. The company's carefully planned publicity campaign had been derailed by the perception that their flagship vessel was accident-prone. By late 1911, White Star and IMM were facing a potential financial catastrophe. They desperately needed good news, successful voyages, positive publicity, and most of all, they needed money. The insurance payout from deliberately sinking one of the ships would solve multiple problems at once. It would provide immediate cash, eliminate the ongoing costs of operating a damaged vessel, and allow them to focus their resources on the remaining ships. Documents from this period, including internal correspondence and financial statements that have been examined by researchers, show that White Star was under enormous pressure from creditors and investors. J.P. Morgan himself was reportedly furious about the Olympic incident and demanding that the company find a way to recover financially. In this context, the idea of switching the Olympic and Titanic, arranging for the damaged Olympic to sink under the Titanic's identity, and collecting the insurance money might not have seemed like a criminal conspiracy. To desperate executives facing financial ruin, it might have seemed like the only way to save the company. The question isn't whether they had motive. They clearly did. The question is whether they actually went through with it. The Titanic switch theory rests on evidence that the two ships were secretly switched while both were docked at the Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast during the winter of 1911 to 1912. According to the theory, workers simply swapped the nameplates, registry numbers, and identifying features of the two ships, sending the damaged Olympic out as the Titanic on what was publicised as the new ship's maiden voyage. At first glance, this seems impossible. The two ships were not identical. Although they were sister ships built to the same basic design, there were hundreds of small differences between them. The Olympic had been completed first and had been in service for months. The Titanic incorporated improvements and modifications based on experience with the Olympic. Surely someone would notice if the ships were switched. But proponents of the switch theory point out that the differences between the ships were relatively minor and could be altered during the months they were both in the Belfast shipyard. More importantly, they argue that photographic evidence clearly shows that the ship that departed Southampton on April 10, 1912, bore distinctive features that matched the Olympic, not the Titanic. The most compelling photographic evidence involves the ship's portholes. This is where the switch theory gets technical, but the details are crucial. The Olympic, as originally built, had 16 portholes evenly spaced along her forward superstructure on B deck. This can be clearly seen in photographs taken when she first entered service in 1911. However, the Titanic was built with 14 portholes in the same location, with different spacing. This difference is visible in photographs taken of the Titanic during her fitting out in Belfast. But here's where it gets interesting. Photographs of the ship that departed on the maiden voyage in April 1912, supposedly the Titanic, clearly show 16 portholes in the B-deck configuration, matching the Olympic's layout, not the Titanic's. This photographic evidence is difficult to dispute. You can count the portholes yourself in contemporary photographs. Supporters of the official history argue that the Titanic's porthole configuration was modified before her maiden voyage to match the Olympic's proven design. But there's no documentation of such a significant modification, and it would be unusual to make such changes so late in the construction process. Moreover, if they were modifying the Titanic to match the Olympic, doesn't that actually support the switch theory? The second major piece of photographic evidence involves the promenade deck. The Olympic's forward promenade on a deck was completely open along its entire length, while the Titanic's promenade was originally designed to be partially enclosed with a glass screen forward. This difference is clearly visible in photographs taken during construction. However, photographs of the ship departing Southampton in April 1912 appear to show an open promenade matching the Olympic's configuration rather than the Titanic's. Again, the official explanation is that the Titanic was modified before her maiden voyage, but documentary evidence for this modification is scarce, and the timing is suspicious given that the Olympic was being repaired at the same time. A third piece of evidence involves the ship's names. Each vessel had her name painted on her bow and stern, and the names were also attached as individual metal letters. Photographs taken of the ship at Southampton show anomalies in the name application that some researchers interpret as evidence of a recent name change. Specifically, the painted name Titanic appears to be unevenly weathered in some photographs, with some portions looking fresh, while others look faded, as if parts of the name had been recently repainted. Similarly, the metal letters spelling out the name appear to sit at slightly different angles, as if they had been removed and reattached, possibly covering previous mountings for different letters. These photographic anomalies are subtle, and mainstream historians argue they're simply artifacts of the photographic process, or tricks of light and shadow. But switch theory proponents contend that they're exactly what you would expect to see if workers had recently changed the ship's name from Olympic to Titanic. Beyond the photographic evidence, there are documentary anomalies that suggest something unusual was happening during the period when both ships were in Belfast. Workers at the Harland and Wolff shipyard reported unusual levels of secrecy during this period, with certain areas of the yard being off limits even to experienced employees. Some sections were reportedly closed off with tarpaulins, preventing anyone from seeing what work was being done. Several workers later claimed, though without definitive proof, that they had been told to swap components between the two ships, or that they had seen nameplates and registry numbers being changed. These accounts are anecdotal and were reported years after the fact, making them difficult to verify. But the consistency of the stories across multiple independent sources suggests something unusual was happening in the shipyard. Most damningly, the official registry numbers of the two ships present a mystery that has never been adequately explained. The Olympic's official number was 400, and the Titanic's was 401. These numbers were permanently engraved in multiple locations on each ship, including on the propellers and deep inside the hull where they couldn't be easily changed. But here's the problem. When the wreck of the Titanic was discovered in 1985 and explored in subsequent expeditions, researchers found that visible registry numbers on certain components showed signs of alteration. Specifically, some numbers appeared to have been changed from 400 to 401, as if someone had modified a 0 into a 1. The most famous example is a propeller serial number that appears in photographs to show clear evidence of modification. The final digit of the number has been described by some researchers as looking like a 0 that was cut and welded to resemble a 1. If true, this would be physical proof that components from the Olympic bearing registry number 400 were used on the ship that sank. Defenders of the official history argue that these apparent modifications are actually damage from the sinking, or corrosion, from decades on the ocean floor. They point out that determining whether a number has been deliberately altered versus naturally degraded is extremely difficult given the condition of the wreck, but the switch theory proponents counter that the pattern of alterations, consistently changing 400 to 401, is too specific to be coincidental damage. If the numbers were simply degraded, you would expect random corruption, not systematic changes that all happen to convert the Olympics registry number into the Titanic's. The photographic and documentary evidence for the switch is circumstantial rather than conclusive. Each piece of evidence can be explained away individually, but taken together, the anomalies form a pattern that is difficult to dismiss entirely. Something unusual was happening in Belfast during the winter of 1911 to 1912, and the ship that sailed on the Titanic's maiden voyage bore suspicious resemblances to the Olympic. If the White Star Line was going to perpetrate an insurance fraud by deliberately sinking one of their ships, they would need a plan that appeared to be a genuine accident. The sinking would have to happen in a plausible way that didn't raise suspicions, and ideally it would happen in a location where the wreck would be difficult or impossible to examine, preventing investigators from discovering evidence of the switch or deliberate sabotage. The plan, according to the switch theory, was brilliantly simple. The ship would be sailed into an area known for icebergs at a time of year when ice was present. The captain would be instructed to maintain high speed despite ice warnings, virtually guaranteeing a collision. When the ship struck an iceberg, it would appear to be a tragic accident rather than deliberate sabotage. And because the ship would sink in the deep waters of the North Atlantic, the wreck would be effectively unreachable with 1912 technology, preventing any investigation that might reveal the fraud. This theory is supported by the actual events of the Titanic's maiden voyage, which includes several highly suspicious circumstances that have never been adequately explained by the official narrative. First, there's the matter of the ship's speed. The Titanic received multiple ice warnings throughout April 14, 1912. At least 6 messages were received reporting ice in the ship's path. The location and extent of the ice field were well documented. Every experienced North Atlantic captain knew that the region the Titanic was entering was dangerous in mid-April. Despite these warnings, Captain Edward Smith maintained the ship's speed at approximately 22 knots, close to full speed. This decision has puzzled historians for decades. Captain Smith was the White Star Line's most experienced commander, with decades of service and an impeccable safety record. He was known for being cautious and prudent. Why would such an experienced captain ignore multiple ice warnings and steam at high speed into a known ice field? The official explanation is that Captain Smith was following standard practice for the era. Ships commonly maintained speed despite ice warnings, relying on lookouts to spot icebergs in time to avoid them. But this explanation is weakened by the fact that conditions on the night of April 14th were particularly dangerous. The sea was unusually calm, making icebergs more difficult to spot because there were no waves breaking against them. The night was moonless and extremely dark. These conditions made maintaining high speed especially reckless. The switch theory offers a different explanation. Captain Smith was following orders from White Star Line executives to maintain speed regardless of ice warnings, because the goal was to ensure the ship hit an iceberg. His decades of loyal service to the company made him the perfect person to carry out such orders. He could be trusted to follow instructions even if those instructions seemed unusual or dangerous. Supporting this interpretation is the fact that Captain Smith was scheduled to retire after the Titanic's maiden voyage. This was to be his last command, his final voyage before a comfortable retirement. If he was part of the conspiracy, he would have been promised a substantial reward for his cooperation, and if something went wrong, he was old enough and wealthy enough that facing consequences wouldn't have been as devastating as it would be for a younger captain with more career ahead of him. Second, there's the mysterious last-minute cancellations. In the days before the Titanic's departure, an unusual number of prominent passengers cancelled their bookings. Most famously, J.P. Morgan himself, who owned the White Star Line through IMM, cancelled his planned voyage at the last minute, claiming illness. Morgan was known to maintain a private suite on the ship and had been publicly announcing his intention to sail on the maiden voyage as a demonstration of confidence in the vessel. But Morgan didn't sail. Neither did several other wealthy and influential passengers who had booked passage but cancelled shortly before departure. The official explanation is that these cancellations were coincidental, that various people had various reasons for changing their plans. But the switch theory suggests something more sinister. Key individuals who knew about the plan were warned to stay off the ship. If Morgan knew the ship was going to be deliberately sunk, he certainly wouldn't have sailed on it himself. and he might have quietly warned close associates and business partners to avoid the voyage without explaining why. This would explain the cluster of last-minute cancellations among the wealthy and well-connected, while ordinary passengers had no such warnings. Third, there's the question of the ship's watertight compartments. The Titanic's designers had incorporated a system of watertight compartments that could be sealed in case of hull damage, supposedly making the ship unsinkable. The ship could theoretically survive having 4 of her 16 compartments flooded. But the iceberg collision breached 5 compartments, one more than the ship could survive. This has always been presented as tragic bad luck, the iceberg damaging just enough compartments to doom the ship. But think about the probability. Of all the possible ways an iceberg could strike the ship, the actual collision happened to cause damage that was just barely sufficient to sink her, but not so catastrophic that she would sink immediately. The switch theory suggests this wasn't luck. The compartment system had a known weakness that the ship's designers were aware of. If the ship were deliberately steered to graze an iceberg along her starboard side at a specific angle and speed, the resulting damage would be almost guaranteed to breach 5 compartments, ensuring the ship would sink, but giving passengers time to evacuate. This would maximise the insurance payout while minimising loss of life, at least in theory. The theory is supported by the actual damage pattern. The iceberg didn't strike the Titanic head-on, which might have caused catastrophic immediate flooding and rapid sinking. Instead, it scraped along the side of the ship, creating a series of smaller breaches across multiple compartments. This damage pattern is consistent with a deliberate glancing blow rather than an unavoidable collision. Fourth, there's the matter of the lifeboats. The Titanic carried lifeboats sufficient for only about half the people aboard, a fact that has been widely criticised since the disaster. But this was actually legal under maritime regulations of the time, which based lifeboat requirements on tonnage rather than passenger capacity, and hadn't been updated to account for the enormous size of modern ships like the Titanic. However, the Titanic's designers had actually proposed including significantly more lifeboats, enough for everyone aboard. These additional boats had been designed and could have been easily installed. But White Star Line management rejected the proposal, arguing that too many lifeboats would clutter the deck and detract from the ship's appearance. The switch theory offers a darker interpretation. If the plan was to deliberately sink the ship, having insufficient lifeboats would serve 2 purposes. First, it would prevent suspicion by ensuring the ship complied with legal requirements, without being unusually safety conscious. Second, and more cynically, it would reduce the number of survivors who might potentially notice anomalies about the ship or testify about suspicious circumstances. This interpretation is supported by the way the lifeboats were actually loaded. Despite having places for about 200 people in the boats, only about 700 actually escaped. Many boats were launched partially empty, some with only a handful of passengers despite having capacity for 60 or more. Officers supervising the evacuation seemed reluctant to fill the boats completely, leading to accusations of incompetence. But what if it wasn't incompetence? What if officers had been instructed to launch boats before they were full, ensuring that fewer people survived to tell the story? Fewer survivors would mean fewer potential witnesses to any anomalies about the ship's identity or suspicious circumstances surrounding the disaster. Fifth, there's the peculiar behaviour of the California, a ship that was stopped in the ice field approximately 10 to 20 miles from the Titanic's position. The California's crew reported seeing a large ship in the distance firing distress rockets. They could clearly see the ship and the rockets, but the California's captain, Stanley Lord, did not investigate or attempt to render assistance. His ship remained stationary throughout the night while the Titanic sank. Captain Lord's behaviour has been harshly criticised for more than a century. He was painted as cowardly or negligent for not responding to obvious distress signals, but his actions have never been fully explained. Why would an experienced captain, seeing a ship clearly in distress, not attempt to help? The switch theory suggests a disturbing possibility. Captain Lord might have been aware of the plan and instructed to remain in the area but not to render assistance. The California's presence served a purpose. Her crew could witness and testify that a ship was in distress, confirming that a genuine disaster had occurred. But by not helping, Lord ensured that the ship actually sank, completing the insurance fraud. His reward for this, cooperation, was substantial, though disguised through various financial mechanisms. This interpretation is supported by the fact that Captain Lord's subsequent career was mysteriously protected despite the severe criticism he faced. He continued working as a ship's captain for years after the disaster, when most captains involved in such controversial circumstances would have been unemployable. Someone with influence was protecting him, possibly because he knew too much about what had really happened. Every element of the Titanic's voyage, from the maintained speed despite ice warnings, to the insufficient lifeboats, to the strange behaviour of nearby ships, can be interpreted as part of a coordinated plan to ensure the ship sank while maintaining the appearance of a tragic accident. The conspirators' goal was to create a disaster that was publicly devastating but privately profitable, and they very nearly succeeded in ensuring that no one would ever question the official narrative. The immediate aftermath of the Titanic disaster saw a massive outpouring of public grief, intense media coverage, and official investigations in both the United States and Britain. But according to the switch theory, these investigations were carefully managed to prevent the truth from emerging and to ensure that the insurance fraud succeeded. The US Senate inquiry began on April 19, 1912, just 4 days after the disaster, led by Senator William Alden Smith. The inquiry heard testimony from survivors, crew members, and shipping industry experts. It concluded that the disaster was caused by excessive speed, inadequate lifeboat provision, and the California's failure to respond to distress signals. These findings were largely critical of White Star Line's practices, but stopped short of suggesting deliberate wrongdoing. The British Board of Trade inquiry, led by Lord Mersey, began on May 2nd and was more technical and detailed. It examined the ship's design, the ice warnings, the navigation, decisions, and the sinking itself. Like the American inquiry, it concluded that the disaster was an accident caused by excessive speed and insufficient lifeboats, though it was somewhat more sympathetic to Captain Smith and the White Star Line. Both inquiries had major limitations that prevented them from uncovering a switch or deliberate sinking. First, neither inquiry examined the wreck itself, which was impossible with 1912 technology. This meant that crucial physical evidence, like the registry numbers that might have shown the ship was actually the Olympic, couldn't be examined. Second, both inquiries relied heavily on testimony from White Star Line employees and officers who had survived. If the switch and deliberate sinking were real, these witnesses would have had strong incentives to support the official narrative. They were either part of the conspiracy and protecting themselves, or they genuinely believed they had been on the Titanic and were testifying in good faith based on false assumptions. Third, both inquiries were under pressure to reach conclusions quickly. The American inquiry in particular was rushed, with Senator Smith wanting to release findings before public attention moved on to other matters. This haste meant that investigators didn't have time to pursue anomalies or question inconsistencies in the testimony. Fourth, and most importantly, both inquiries had institutional reasons to avoid finding that the disaster was deliberate. If the sinking had been an insurance fraud orchestrated by White Star Line, it would have been a massive scandal implicating one of the world's largest shipping companies, controlled by one of the world's most powerful financiers, J.P. Morgan. The political and economic ramifications would have been enormous. For the British inquiry especially, there were strong incentives to protect Harland and Wolff and the broader British shipping industry. Harland and Wolff was one of Belfast's largest employers and a source of national pride. The British shipbuilding industry was engaged in intense competition with German yards. Revealing that a British shipyard had participated in a criminal conspiracy would have damaged the industry's reputation and potentially cost thousands of jobs. Lord Mersey, who led the British inquiry, later expressed dissatisfaction with the investigation and even refused the customary honorarium for his work, saying he was uncomfortable with how the inquiry had been conducted. He never publicly explained this discomfort, but some researchers interpret it as evidence that he suspected the official findings were incomplete or deliberately misleading. The insurance settlement also raises suspicious questions. White Star Line had insured the Titanic for $5 million, a sum worth approximately $130 million today. But the ship had cost significantly more to build, meaning White Star actually took a financial loss when you account for construction costs. However, this apparent loss doesn't account for the broader financial picture. The insurance payment provided immediate liquid capital that White Star desperately needed. It allowed the company to pay debts, fund the completion of the third sister ship Britannic, and continue operations during a difficult financial period. Moreover, the publicity from the disaster while initially negative, eventually proved beneficial. The Titanic became the most famous ship in history, and White Star's other vessels benefited from the public fascination. Most importantly, the insurance settlement prevented scrutiny of the Olympic. If the damaged Olympic had continued in service with her compromised hull, she might have experienced additional problems that would have revealed the extent of her damage from the Hawke collision. By removing the damaged ship from service, claiming it was the Titanic that sank, White Star avoided years of potential problems with a vessel that was structurally compromised. The insurance. Payment was made relatively quickly, with minimal investigation of White Star's claim. This is suspicious given the enormous sum involved. Modern insurance companies would conduct exhaustive investigations before paying out millions of dollars on a major loss. But in 1912, the insurers apparently accepted White Star's account of events without extensive independent verification. Switch theory proponents argue that the insurers might have been complicit in the fraud, or at least chose not to investigate too carefully. Insurance companies have occasionally been willing to pay fraudulent claims when the alternative would be exposing a scandal that might destabilize the entire industry. If the Titanic switch became public, it could have triggered a crisis in maritime insurance, with underwriters questioning whether they could trust any claim from shipping companies. It was better for everyone involved, the theory suggests, to accept the official story, pay the claim and move on. The conspiracy succeeded not because it was perfect, but because all the powerful interests involved had reasons to maintain the fiction rather than expose the fraud. If the Titanic switch theory is correct, then the ship that sank on April 15, 1912 was actually the damaged Olympic, and the real Titanic survived and continued operating under a different identity. But what happened to her? Where is the real Titanic now? According to switch theory researchers, the Titanic was renamed and continued sailing in White Star Line service for decades. The most common candidate for the Titanic's new identity is the third sister ship, the HMHS Britannic. The Britannic was launched in 1914 as World War I was beginning. She was immediately requisitioned by the British government and converted into a hospital ship. On November 21st, 1916, while serving in the Aegean Sea, the Britannic struck a mine, or possibly a torpedo, nobody knows for certain, and sank in just 55 minutes. The official history says the Britannic was the third sister ship, newly built and recently launched. But the switch theory suggests otherwise. The theory proposes that the ship launched as the Britannic was actually the original Titanic, renamed after the switch. The real Britannic was never completed, or was completed but used for another purpose under yet another name. This sub-theory is supported by several pieces of evidence. First, construction records for the Britannic show unusual delays and modifications that are difficult to explain if she was simply a third ship built to the same basic design as her sisters. The delays and modifications make more sense if the ship being worked on was actually the Titanic, which would have required modifications to disguise her identity. Second, photographs of the Britannic show that she had the same porthole configuration as the ship that sailed as the Titanic in April 1912, not the configuration that the original Titanic was supposed to have had. This suggests continuity between the ship that sailed on the maiden voyage and the ship that became the Britannic, supporting the idea that they were the same vessel. Third, the Britannic's sinking was surprisingly rapid. For a ship that incorporated safety improvements specifically designed to prevent a repeat of the Titanic disaster, the Britannic had enhanced watertight compartments and other modifications that should have made her much more survivable than her older sisters, yet she sank faster than the Titanic did, which is difficult to explain unless there was pre-existing structural damage that compromised her hull integrity. The switch theory suggests that the ship launched as the Britannic was actually the real Titanic, which had never been damaged. But during her conversion to a hospital ship and her subsequent service, the vessel that sank in 1916 was actually the Olympic, which had been sailing as the Britannic after briefly sailing as the Titanic. The rapid sinking would make sense if the hull had been compromised by the 1911 collision with the Hawke, making her vulnerable to the mine or torpedo strike. This creates a complex shuffle of identities. The Olympic became the Titanic for the maiden voyage and sank. The real Titanic became the Britannic and continued sailing, possibly surviving until the late 1930s when many ships of that generation were scrapped. And the ship that sank as the Britannic in 1916 was actually the second Olympic, still operating under false identity. This identity shuffle theory is admittedly the most speculative part of the switch hypothesis. The evidence is thinner and requires accepting an even more complex conspiracy. But it does solve one of the major problems with the basic switch theory, namely, what happened to the real Titanic after the switch. The alternative explanation, accepted by most switch theory proponents, is simpler. After the switch, the real Titanic sailed as the Olympic for another 24 years until she was scrapped in 1935. This version of events suggests that the ship known as the Olympic from 1912 to 1935 was actually the Titanic, while the damaged Olympic sank on the maiden voyage under the Titanic's identity. This simpler version is supported by the fact that the ship sailing as the Olympic after 1912 had a long and remarkably trouble-free career. She served as a troop ship during World War I, earned the nickname Old Reliable for her dependability, and operated profitably for White Star Line for more than 2 decades. This successful service is easier to understand if the ship was actually the undamaged Titanic rather than the Olympic, which should have had ongoing structural problems from the Hawke collision. When the Olympic was finally scrapped in 1935, workers reported that the ship was in remarkably good condition for her age. The hull was sound, the engines were efficient, and the structure was solid. This is surprising for a ship that had supposedly been severely damaged in a collision in 1911 and then operated continuously for 24 years. It makes more sense if the ship being scrapped was actually the Titanic, which had never been damaged and was structurally superior to the Olympic. Photographs of the ship being scrapped in 1935 show the same porthole configuration that was visible on the ship that departed on the Titanic's maiden voyage in 1912. This photographic evidence supports the idea that the ship sailing as the Olympic after 1912 was actually the Titanic, maintaining the configuration she'd been given during the switch. The ultimate fate of the real Titanic, according to this version of the switch theory, was mundane. She was cut up for scrap metal in 1935, her steel recycled, her fittings sold to collectors and museums. The most famous ship in history ended not at the bottom of the Atlantic, but in a scrapyard in England, her true identity hidden to the end. When the wreck of the Titanic was discovered by Robert Ballard in 1985, it should have settled all questions about the ship's identity. Finally, the physical evidence was available. The ship at the bottom of the Atlantic could be examined, measured, and compared against known specifications for both the Titanic and the Olympic. The switch theory should have been definitively proven or disproven, but things didn't work out that simply. The wreck evidence has, if anything, intensified the debate rather than settling it. Both sides of the controversy claim that the wreck supports their position, and the condition of the wreck makes definitive identification more difficult than you might expect. The wreck lies at a depth of about 2,500 feet, roughly 2.4 miles down. At this depth, the pressure is immense, about 6,000 pounds per square inch. The ship has been sitting in near freezing water for more than a century, corroding and being consumed by bacteria that are literally eating the iron. The wreck is deteriorating rapidly, with major structures collapsing as the metal weakens. The most definitive way to identify the wreck would be to find the registry numbers that were engraved on the ship. These numbers should be visible on the propellers, on certain hull plates, and on equipment throughout the ship. If these numbers clearly show 401, the Titanic's registry number, then the switch theory would be disproven. If they show 400, the Olympic's number, or if they show evidence of alteration from 400 to 401, then the switch theory would be supported. But examining these numbers has proven extraordinarily difficult. The propellers are buried in silt on the ocean floor. The hull is covered in rusticles, rust formations created by iron-eating bacteria that obscure details. Equipment that might bear registry numbers is scattered across a debris field, covering many square miles, and the locations where numbers were engraved are often the most corroded and damaged parts of the wreck. Despite these challenges, several expeditions have attempted to find and photograph registry numbers. The results have been controversial and contradictory. Some photographs from the wreck appear to show the number 401 on certain components, supporting the official identification. But switch theory proponents argue that these numbers show signs of alteration, with the final digit looking like it was modified from a 0 to a 1. They point to the shape of the digit, which they claim shows evidence of cutting and welding, rather than being a cleanly cast or stamped 1. other photographs show areas where registry numbers should be visible but are not, either because of corrosion or because the numbers were deliberately removed. Switch theory supporters argue that this absence is suspicious. If the ship really was the Titanic, why would any registry numbers be missing? But if the ship was the Olympic masquerading as the Titanic, then numbers that clearly showed 400 would have needed to be removed or altered, and some might have been simply ground off rather than changed. One of the most controversial pieces of wreck evidence involves the ship's nameplate. The Titanic's name should be visible on the hull, cast or welded in large letters. Several expeditions have searched for this nameplate, and portions of it have been photographed. But the condition of the letters is curious. The name appears to be applied in a way that some researchers describe as inconsistent with how the Titanic's name would have been originally attached. The mounting points don't quite match the pattern that would be expected. Some letters appear to be at slightly different angles from others, as if they were removed and reattached. And most tellingly, some researchers claim to see ghost images of different letters beneath the visible name, suggesting that a previous name was covered over. These observations are highly subjective and disputed by other researchers who have examined the same photographs. The condition of the wreck makes it difficult to distinguish between damage from the sinking, a century of corrosion, and potential evidence of name alteration. Both sides can look at the same photographs and see evidence supporting their position. Beyond registry numbers and nameplates, researchers have examined other identifying features of the wreck to determine whether it's the Titanic or the Olympic. This is where the porthole evidence becomes crucial. The wreck, in its current condition, shows the remains of the B-deck forward superstructure, where the distinctive porthole pattern should be visible. Expeditions have photographed this area extensively, counting and measuring the portholes. The results are troubling for the official history. The wreck clearly shows 16 portholes in this location, matching the Olympic's configuration, not the 14 that the Titanic was supposed to have had originally. This is the same configuration visible in photographs of the ship departing Southampton on the maiden voyage. Defenders of the official history point out correctly that the Titanic's porthole configuration was modified before her maiden voyage, so finding 16 portholes doesn't prove the wreck is the Olympic. But this raises the question of why such a modification was made, and why it was done to match the Olympic's configuration exactly. The most logical explanation is that the two ships were being made to look identical, which is exactly what you would expect if a switch was being planned. Another piece of wreck evidence involves the ship's construction number. In addition to registry numbers, ships are marked with construction numbers assigned by the shipyard. The Olympic was Harland and Wolff construction number 400, and the Titanic was number 401, matching their registry numbers. Construction numbers should be stamped or engraved in multiple locations throughout the ship, often in areas that were never intended to be visible after construction was complete. These hidden numbers would be much more difficult to alter than visible registry numbers, making them more reliable for identification. Several expeditions have attempted to find and photograph construction numbers on the wreck. The results have been limited because many of the locations where such numbers would be stamped are inaccessible or destroyed. But the few numbers that have been found and photographed are controversial. Some researchers claim to have found construction numbers showing 400, which would prove the wreck is the Olympic, not the Titanic. They've published photographs showing what they interpret as a clear 400 stamped into metal components, but other researchers examining the same photographs interpret the markings differently, seeing 401 or seeing numbers too damaged and corroded to read definitively. The debate over these construction numbers has become heated, with both sides accusing the other of seeing what they want to see rather than what's actually there. The photographs are genuinely ambiguous, showing corroded and damaged metal where numbers might or might not be visible. Without being able to clean and properly examine the components in laboratory conditions, definitive readings are impossible. Perhaps the most intriguing wreck evidence involves the ship's wheel and helm equipment. The Olympic and Titanic had slightly different steering equipment due to modifications made after the Hawke collision. The Olympic's steering was modified to improve manoeuvrability, while the Titanic's steering was built to a slightly different specification. These differences should be identifiable on the wreck if the helm equipment can be examined. Several expeditions have photographed the wheelhouse area and the steering mechanism remnants. Switch theory proponents claim that the visible equipment matches the Olympic's modified steering rather than the Titanic's original design. But again, the evidence is ambiguous. The steering equipment is badly damaged, making identification of specific components difficult. and both ships' steering systems were similar enough that distinguishing between them requires examining details that may no longer be visible on the corroded wreck. The most frustrating aspect of the wreck evidence is that despite more than 3 decades of exploration and thousands of photographs, nothing has been found that definitively proves the wreck's identity beyond doubt. Every piece of evidence that might settle the question is either too damaged to read clearly, open to multiple interpretations, or contradicted by other evidence. This ambiguity itself is suspicious to switch theory supporters. They argue that if the wreck was straightforwardly the Titanic, clear identification should be relatively easy. The fact that it's not, they suggest, indicates that someone went to great lengths to obscure the ship's true identity. Mainstream historians counter that the ambiguity is simply the result of examining a wreck that's been sitting in corrosive seawater under immense pressure for more than a century. Under these conditions, they argue, clear identification was never going to be easy, and the difficulty doesn't indicate fraud, just the limits of marine archaeology. The debate continues, with new expeditions producing new photographs that both sides interpret as supporting their position. Until someone finds indisputable physical evidence, the wreck that lies at the bottom of the Atlantic will remain, like so much about this disaster, open to interpretation. If the Titanic switch theory is correct, it means that JP Morgan and the executives of the White Star Line conspired to sink a ship full of passengers for insurance money. This raises an obvious moral question. How could anyone contemplate such a monstrous crime? And if they did, how could they live with the guilt of causing more than 500 deaths? The answer, according to the theory's proponents, lies in a combination of desperation, rationalization, and the assumption that most passengers would be saved. The financial desperation was real and documented. White Star and IMM were facing potential bankruptcy. JP Morgan had invested enormous sums that were at risk of being lost entirely. Thousands of jobs depended on the company's survival. In this context, a plan that would save the company might have seemed justified despite the risks involved. The conspirators would have rationalized that the sinking would be controlled. The plan wasn't to cause massive loss of life, but to stage a manageable accident. The ship would strike an iceberg in a glancing blow, creating damage sufficient to sink her slowly over several hours. This would give ample time for nearby ships to arrive and rescue everyone aboard. In theory, the disaster would be dramatic enough to justify the insurance claim but not deadly enough to be a mass murder. This rationalization is supported by the fact that the plan, as executed, did allow several hours for evacuation. The Titanic struck the iceberg at 11:40 p.m. and didn't sink until 2:20 a.m., nearly 3 hours later. If rescue ships had arrived promptly, everyone could have been saved. The presence of the Californian, stopped in the ice field just 10 to 20 miles away, supports this interpretation. The conspirators might have arranged for the Californian to be nearby, ready to rescue passengers once the sinking began. The plan would have been for the Titanic to signal for help, the Californian to respond immediately, and for everyone to be transferred safely while the ship slowly sank. But the plan went horrifically wrong, for reasons the conspirators apparently didn't anticipate. First, the Californian didn't respond to the Titanic's distress signals. Whether this was because Captain Lord misunderstood the situation, was asleep, or was following instructions to remain stopped, the result was that the nearest ship didn't come to help. Without the Californian's assistance, there weren't enough lifeboats for everyone aboard. Second, the ship sank faster than expected. The conspirators had apparently planned for the collision to breach 4 compartments, allowing the ship to stay afloat for many hours. But the actual damage breached 5 compartments, dooming the ship and reducing the time available for evacuation. Whether this was a miscalculation or whether the iceberg caused more damage than intended, the result was that time ran out before everyone could be saved. Third, other ships were farther away than anticipated. The RMS Carpathia, which did respond to the distress signals and rescued the survivors, was 58 miles away and took nearly 4 hours to arrive. By the time she reached the scene, the Titanic had been gone for nearly 2 hours, and more than 1,500 people were dead. The conspirators, according to this theory, had never intended for so many people to die. They had planned a controlled sinking with minimal casualties. When the plan went wrong, and the disaster became far deadlier than intended, they were trapped. They couldn't expose the fraud without admitting their role in causing the deaths. They had to maintain the fiction that it was a genuine accident, even as they privately struggled with the guilt of having caused such a catastrophe. This interpretation is supported by the subsequent behaviour of some of the key figures. J.P. Morgan, who was supposed to sail on the Titanic but cancelled at the last minute, was reportedly devastated by the disaster. He spent the days immediately after the sinking in seclusion, refusing to see anyone. This is unusual for a man of his position and temperament. If the disaster was simply an unfortunate accident, why would Morgan be so personally affected? J. Bruce Ismay, the chairman of White Star Line who did sail on the Titanic and survived, was destroyed by the disaster. He was vilified in the press for saving himself while so many died, accused of cowardice, and of urging Captain Smith to maintain dangerous speed. After the inquiries, Ismay withdrew from public life, resigned his positions and lived in relative seclusion until his death in 1937. Ismay's behaviour after the disaster is consistent with a man carrying enormous guilt. If he was part of the conspiracy and knew that the sinking was deliberate, he would have been haunted by the knowledge that he was responsible for more than 1,500 deaths. The public criticism of his survival would have been especially painful because he couldn't defend himself without admitting the truth. Captain Smith went down with his ship as tradition demanded. If he was part of the conspiracy, his death could be interpreted as atonement for his role in the disaster. Some researchers have suggested that Smith deliberately chose to die because he couldn't live with what he had done. Others argue that Smith might not have been fully aware of the plan, that he was simply following orders to maintain speed and only realised during the sinking that he had been manipulated into causing a disaster. The true extent of the conspiracy, if it existed, remains unclear. It's possible that only a handful of people at the very top of White Star and IMM knew the full plan. Others might have been given instructions that seemed unusual, but not obviously criminal. Workers who participated in switching the ship's identities might not have understood why they were doing it. Officers who followed orders to maintain speed might not have known that hitting an iceberg was the intended outcome, rather than a risk to be avoided. This compartmentalization would have been essential for the conspiracy to work. The fewer people who knew the full truth, the less likely it would be exposed, and those who did know would be bound by their complicity. Once they had participated in the fraud, they couldn't expose it without implicating themselves in mass murder. The moral calculus of the conspirators, if the theory is true, involved a tragic miscalculation. They thought they could stage a controlled sinking that would save their company without costing lives. When the plan went wrong and became one of the deadliest peacetime maritime disasters in history, they found themselves trapped in a lie they couldn't escape without destroying themselves. More than a century after the Titanic sank, the switch theory remains controversial but persistent. Despite mainstream historians' rejection of the theory, it continues to attract supporters and generate new research. Why does this theory endure when most conspiracy theories eventually fade away or are definitively disproven? The answer lies partly in the quality of the evidence. Unlike many conspiracy theories that rely on vague allegations and circumstantial reasoning, the Titanic switch theory is supported by specific, verifiable evidence. The photographic record of porthole differences, the documented financial pressures on White Star Line, the suspicious circumstances surrounding the voyage. These are real facts that require explanation regardless of whether you accept the switch theory. Mainstream historians have explanations for each piece of evidence individually, but they struggle to explain the pattern of anomalies collectively. Why were the portholes changed to match the Olympic? Why did Morgan and other wealthy passengers cancel at the last minute? Why did Captain Smith maintain speed despite ice warnings? Why didn't the Californian respond to distress signals? Each question has a conventional answer, but the answers require accepting a remarkable series of coincidences. The switch theory offers a simpler explanation that connects all these anomalies into a coherent narrative. Occam's razor suggests that the explanation requiring fewer coincidences might be the correct one. The theory also endures because of what happened after the disaster. The official inquiries were inadequate and appeared designed to avoid embarrassing conclusions. The insurance settlement was suspiciously quick. Key witnesses died or disappeared before. They could be fully questioned. And the ship that sailed as the Olympic after 1912 had a mysteriously trouble-free career despite supposedly having severe structural damage. These post-disaster anomalies are difficult to explain if the sinking was simply an accident. but they make perfect sense if powerful interests were working to maintain a profitable fiction. The discovery of the wreck in 1985 should have settled the debate, but instead it created new controversies. The ambiguous registry numbers, the suspicious nameplate, the construction details that don't quite match, all of these keep the theory alive by preventing definitive identification of the wreck. Moreover, new evidence continues to emerge. As digitization makes historical records more accessible, researchers find previously unknown documents that seem to support the switch theory. Descendants of people who worked at Harland and Wolff come forward with family stories about the unusual secrecy during the period when both ships were in Belfast. Forensic analysis of photographs reveals details that weren't visible with older technology. Each new piece of evidence is disputed by mainstream historians, but the cumulative effect is to prevent the theory from being dismissed entirely. As long as questions remain unanswered and anomalies remain unexplained, the switch theory will persist. The theory also endures because it resonates with broader suspicions about how power operates. The Titanic disaster occurred during the Gilded Age, a period of enormous inequality and corporate power. JP Morgan was one of the most powerful men in the world, controlling banks, railroads, and industrial companies. The idea that someone of his wealth and influence might commit murder for profit is not implausible to many people. In our contemporary era of corporate scandals, financial fraud, and regulatory capture, the switch theory feels plausible. We know that companies have lied about safety issues, concealed fatal defects, and prioritised profit over human life. The idea that White Star Line might have deliberately sunk a ship for insurance money seems only slightly more extreme than documented corporate crimes. The theory also benefits from the mythology that has grown around the Titanic. The disaster has been the subject of countless books, films, documentaries, and exhibitions. This intense focus means that every detail has been examined, every photograph analysed, every testimony scrutinised. This level of attention naturally reveals anomalies and inconsistencies that might be overlooked in less famous disasters. Finally, the theory endures because it can't be definitively disproven. The wreck is deteriorating and will eventually disappear entirely. The people involved are all dead. The documentary record is incomplete and contradictory. No smoking gun proving the switch has emerged, but neither has definitive evidence disproving it. This ambiguity is frustrating for historians who want clear answers, but it ensures that the debate continues. As long as doubt exists, researchers will keep investigating, new theories will be proposed, and the Titanic switch will remain one of history's most compelling unsolved mysteries. To be fair to mainstream historians, and to present a balanced view, we need to examine the strongest arguments against the Titanic switch theory. These arguments don't prove the theory is false, but they highlight the significant challenges it faces and the reasons why most experts reject it. The first and most powerful argument against the switch is the sheer logistical difficulty of executing it. Switching two enormous ships, each more than 880 feet long and weighing 46,000 tons, would require the cooperation of hundreds of people. Workers at Harland and Wolff would need to swap nameplates, registry numbers, and identifying features. Officers and crew would need to accept that they were sailing on a different ship than they thought. Passengers who had toured the Titanic during her fitting out would need to not notice that the ship they boarded in Southampton was different. This level of coordination seems implausible without someone exposing the fraud. In every major conspiracy that has been confirmed, from Watergate to the Tuskegee experiments, whistleblowers eventually came forward. People have difficulty keeping secrets, especially when hundreds of people are involved. Yet no credible whistleblower has ever provided definitive proof of the Titanic switch. Defenders of the switch theory argue that the workers involved might not have understood what they were doing, that they were simply following orders without knowing the full plan. They also point out that in 1912, workers had less power and less ability to challenge their employers. Speaking out against White Star Line or Harland and Wolff could have meant losing your job and being blacklisted from the industry. But even accounting for these factors, the absence of any contemporary whistleblower is difficult to explain if the conspiracy was real. Surely someone involved would have been troubled enough by the disaster to come forward, especially after more than 1,500 people died. The second major argument against the switch is that the differences between the Olympic and Titanic were more extensive than switch theory proponents acknowledge. While the two ships were sisters built to the same basic design, There were thousands of small differences in their internal layout, decoration, equipment, and fixtures. The first-class accommodations were decorated differently, with different woods, fabrics, and design elements. The restaurants and public rooms had different layouts. The crew quarters and service areas had different configurations based on lessons learned from the Olympic's early voyages. Even the engines and mechanical systems had minor differences. For the switch to work, all of these differences would need to be addressed. Either the ships would need to be made identical, requiring massive reconstruction work, or passengers and crew would need to not notice that the ship they thought was the Titanic actually had the Olympic's interior. Neither option seems plausible given the time available and the number of people who would have noticed discrepancies. Switch theory supporters argue that most passengers and crew had never been on either ship before and wouldn't know what to expect. Only a few people who had sailed on the Olympic's early voyages would potentially notice differences, and they could be managed or discredited. But this argument requires believing that extensive interior differences could be overlooked or explained away, which strains credibility. The third argument concerns the wreck itself. While registry numbers and construction numbers on the wreck are ambiguous, other features should definitively identify it as either the Olympic or Titanic. The ships had different propeller configurations, different engine mountings, and different hull plating patterns in certain locations. Marine archaeologists who have examined the wreck extensively maintain that these features match the Titanic's known specifications, not the Olympic's. They argue that switch theory proponents selectively highlight ambiguous evidence while ignoring clear evidence that contradicts their theory. Specifically, the wreck's propellers, though partially buried, have been examined and photographed. Experts maintain that they match the Titanic's 3-propeller configuration with specific blade designs that differed from the Olympic's. Similarly, the engine mounting points visible in the wreck correspond to the Titanic's engine specifications, which were slightly different from the Olympic's due to improvements made during construction. Switch theory advocates counter that these examinations are not independent. The archaeologists and expedition leaders have strong professional incentives to support the official identification. Their reputations, funding, and future projects depend on maintaining the narrative that they discovered the Titanic, not some other ship. This creates bias in how they interpret ambiguous evidence, but this argument cuts both ways. Switch theory proponents also have incentives to find evidence supporting their theory, including financial incentives from books, documentaries, and speaking engagements. Neither side is perfectly objective, which makes evaluating the evidence even more difficult. The fourth argument involves the behaviour of the ship during its final voyage. Crew members and passengers who survived the sinking provided detailed testimony about the ship's performance, handling characteristics, and behaviour during the collision and sinking. This testimony describes a ship that matched the Titanic's specifications and expected performance. If the ship was actually the Olympic, with structural damage from the Hawke collision, it should have behaved differently. The damaged hull should have affected the ship's handling, speed, and response to the iceberg collision. But survivors reported that the ship performed exactly as a new, undamaged vessel would be expected to perform. Switch theory supporters argue that the Olympic's damage was repaired well enough, that performance wasn't noticeably affected, or that any performance issues were attributed to the ship being new and not fully broken in. But this requires believing that extensive damage from the Hawke collision could be repaired to the point where even experienced seamen couldn't detect any problems, which seems unlikely given the severity of the original damage. The fifth, and perhaps most compelling argument against the switch is, why would White Star Line risk it? The insurance payout, while substantial, was less than the ship's construction cost. The risk of exposure was enormous. If the fraud was discovered, the company would be destroyed, executives would face criminal charges, and JP Morgan's reputation would be permanently ruined. The potential reward doesn't seem to justify the risk, especially when there were other ways to address White Star's financial problems. The company could have taken loans, sold assets, or negotiated with creditors. Why commit an elaborate fraud with enormous potential consequences when less risky options were available? Switch theory proponents argue that the financial pressure was more severe than public records showed, and that conventional solutions weren't available. But this requires believing that a company owned by one of the world's richest men was so desperate that insurance fraud and potential mass murder seem like reasonable options. While corporate executives have certainly committed crimes for profit, the scale of the Titanic fraud seems disproportionate to the financial gain. These arguments don't prove the switch theory is false, but they highlight why mainstream historians remain skeptical. The theory requires believing in an extraordinarily complex conspiracy involving hundreds of people, executed with perfect secrecy, for a reward that barely justified the risk, resulting in a disaster that killed more than 500 people. While possible, this seems less plausible than the simpler explanation that the Titanic sank as a result of hubris, bad decisions, and tragic bad luck. As we finish this investigation, I'm left with a profound sense of uncertainty. The Titanic switch theory is simultaneously one of the most compelling and most troubling conspiracy theories in modern history. Unlike theories about aliens or secret societies, this one involves documented financial pressures, verifiable photographic evidence, and real anomalies in the official narrative that demand explanation. The evidence for the switch is substantial but circumstantial. The porthole differences, the suspicious timing of the Olympics repairs and the Titanic's completion, the financial desperation at White, Starline, the strange circumstances of the voyage, the ambiguous wreck evidence, all of these create a pattern that's difficult to dismiss entirely. But the evidence against the switch is also powerful. The logistical challenges of executing such a fraud, the absence of credible whistleblowers, the wreck features that match the Titanic, and the question of whether the reward justified the risk all argue against the theory's plausibility. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere between the extremes. Maybe there wasn't a complete switch of identities, but there was extensive salvage of components from the Olympic to the Titanic to save money. Maybe the voyage wasn't deliberately planned to end in disaster, but financial pressure led to decisions that made disaster much more likely. Maybe some people knew more than they admitted, while others were genuinely deceived. What's undeniable is that the Titanic disaster involves questions that remain unanswered more than a century later. Why did Captain Smith maintain speed despite ice warnings? Why didn't the Californian respond to distress signals? Why were there so many last-minute cancellations among wealthy passengers? Why was the insurance settled so quickly? These questions deserve answers regardless of whether you believe in the switch theory. The Titanic story, as we've been taught it, is a morality tale about hubris and the limits of human technology. The unsinkable ship that sank on her maiden voyage serves as a cautionary reminder that pride comes before a fall, that we should respect nature's power, that tragedy can strike even the most carefully planned endeavours. But if the switch theory is correct, even partially, then the real story is far darker. It's not a tale of tragic accident, but of deliberate crime. It's not about hubris, but about greed. It's not about the limits of technology, but about the limitlessness of human capacity for rationalization and moral compromise. The question isn't just what happened to the Titanic on that cold April night in 1912. The question is what we're willing to believe about the people who had the power to make decisions that affected thousands of lives. Are we willing to believe that respected business leaders, under financial pressure, might conspire to commit insurance fraud even if it risked mass casualties? Are we willing to believe that such a conspiracy could be maintained for more than a century despite intensive investigation? These questions force us to confront uncomfortable truths about power, about how the wealthy and influential operate by different rules, about how history is written by those who survive to tell it. If the Titanic switch happened, it proves that enormous crimes can be concealed through coordination, money, and control of the narrative. If it didn't happen, it proves how powerful circumstantial evidence can create false certainty about events we weren't present for. Either way, the Titanic disaster remains what it has always been, a tragedy of profound proportions. More than 2,500 people died, most of them third-class passengers and crew who had no say in the decisions that led to their deaths. Children lost parents, families were destroyed, entire communities mourned. Whether those deaths were the result of tragic accident or criminal conspiracy, they deserve to be remembered honestly. The victims deserve justice, even if that justice is only historical acknowledgement of what really happened that night. The wreck of the Titanic lies 2.5 miles down in the dark Atlantic. It's deteriorating rapidly, consumed by bacteria and crushed by pressure. Within a few more decades it will collapse entirely, erasing the last physical evidence that might definitively prove or disprove the switch theory. When the wreck is gone, all that will remain are the photographs, the documents, the survivor testimonies, and the questions that have haunted this disaster from the beginning. The truth, whatever it is, will become even more difficult to determine, but perhaps that's appropriate. Perhaps some historical mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, serving as reminders that the past is never as simple as we want it to be, that the official narrative is always incomplete, and that power has a way of obscuring its own crimes. The Titanic, whether she was truly the Titanic or secretly the Olympic, took her secrets with her when she sank. And those secrets, like the ship herself, lie in darkness where we can glimpse them only partially, never quite seeing the full truth. That's tonight's deep dive into the Titanic switch theory. One of history's most famous disasters that might actually be history's most elaborate fraud. A tragedy that killed more than 1,500 people, that might have been deliberate rather than accidental. A story we all think we know that might be almost entirely fiction. Is it true? I can't tell you definitively. The evidence is fascinating, the anomalies are real, the financial motive was documented, and the circumstantial case is stronger than almost any other historical conspiracy theory. But proving it beyond doubt remains elusive, and may remain impossible now that most of the evidence is corroding at the bottom of the ocean. What I can tell you is that this theory raises questions we should all consider. How much do we really know about famous historical events? Who controls the narrative of major disasters? What crimes might the wealthy and powerful commit when facing financial ruin? And how long can a lie persist when everyone with power has incentives to maintain it? If you found this investigation thought-provoking, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Drop a comment letting me know what you think. Could the Titanic switch have really happened? Or is it an elaborate theory built from coincidences and misinterpreted evidence? And most importantly, suggest topics for future episodes. Your ideas keep this channel going, and trust me, history is full of disasters, disappearances, and mysteries that deserve deeper investigation. Until next time, question everything, especially the stories that everyone agrees are settled truth. Because sometimes the most famous story is the most incomplete one. Sleep well, if you can.